Hello everyone, my name is Benjamin Yoder with OneControlPort.com, here today to talk to you about the future of video games and how I probably will not be participating in them anytime soon, or at least not within the next year or so probably. If you're usually tuned into the podcast, the background looks different. I'm in front of my couch here because I'm under my kotatsu. I bought a kotatsu early this year. Now I'm down here getting my legs toasty. It's barely cold enough to be in a kotatsu. So, I don't know, getting the most out of it. Will we ever come back and do a video from here again? Who can say? But here we are. But yeah, I want to talk today about the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. And if you listen to the podcast regularly, I don't think anything I'm going to say today is really going to stand out from that stuff I've said before. It's just kind of compiling the thoughts into one particular video here. If you don't know, or rather, I'm recording this on the day the Xbox Series X came out, and then also the PlayStation 5 comes out later this week. So I thought it was kind of appropriate, but I'm sure this video will not have any particularly long legs or anything like that. But I want to talk a little bit about, why I don't plan to buy right now. I've had a lot of people ask me about, what I'm going to do about the next gen consoles, what my plans are. And then I also want to talk about, what I would need from these platforms and how I'll probably end up making my decision of which platform I ended up going with. And the thing I also want to say is that, hey man, console purchases, you do you. If you bought your console already, you got an Xbox Series X, and I say something that makes you unhappy, who cares as long as you're happy with your console purchase? What if you don't want either? You just want to play games on the PC? You can do that. So you do you when it comes to buying consoles, and be happy with what you have chosen. There will be video games for both of these consoles, so don't think about it too much. And I think part of why I wanted to do today's video is I was kind of surprised by the fact that it did not feel like a launch today with the Xbox Series X. And I think there's a lot of reasons why. One is that there's no particularly big flashy game, particularly on the Xbox Series X, but we'll talk a little bit about PlayStation 5 and how I feel about some of the library there. And the other thing is that a lot of the titles coming out are cross-gen releases, which is not particularly anything new, but there's some stuff I want to talk about a little bit with that. And then, finally also, in the year of 2020, coronavirus stuff happened. So obviously, game development's been affected, PR plans and how these consoles roll out has likely been affected. And also, you're not really getting those big launch party kind of things. Although, you don't really get those like with the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One either. That's definitely been less and less of a thing. But I felt like you did get a lot more like, community stream kind of things where Giant Bomb would go and have everybody in the office, streaming this console kind of thing out to you over a stream, where now it's like everybody is doing it from their own little window in a group chat kind of thing, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? But it's just a little different. So it feels a little weird, I think. So yeah, I was just kind of surprised that it just didn't really feel like a launch. But I think the biggest thing is just not really having, one big game that stands out to me as like a launch title that really feels like it's showing off what the PlayStation 5 can do, or at least defining the PlayStation 5 early on, right? So when I think about like the PlayStation 5, what's coming out there, I think the only thing that really jumps out at me is probably Demon's Souls, and it looks well, a couple of reasons. One, it's I think literally the only true PS5 exclusive. Most other stuff is either coming to PS4 and PC at some point, or one or the other. And Demon's Souls, I know they announced in that showcase that it's eventually going to probably be coming to PC, and they retracted that later. It's like, oh, it was a mistake. I question if that was a mistake, especially since Final Fantasy 16 had the same thing. But yeah, I mean, at least for right now, it is the one true exclusive. Admittedly, it is a PlayStation 3 title being, remade. So how new that thing is another thing. But, personally, I don't really have any big investment in it. I haven't played really any of the I almost said Dark Cloud, Dark Souls games. I played the original Dark Souls for like 5 hours, but I just, there's plenty of games in that puddle of, I don't know what you'd call it, action, slow paced kind of game, third person action game that I don't really feel any any real strong need to play that particular game. I wouldn't even mind playing the original PS3 game or PS3 version of Demon Souls. Although I think the servers that supported some of the functionality is now shut down, so that's maybe a good reason why not to play that version of the game. And the other game that kind of, I don't know if it stood out to me per se, but it felt like very much like a more typical launch game is Godfall, which I believe is by the developers of Borderlands. I'm blanking on their name right now. Gearbox. And, you know, I would not say Godfall looks like a good game, but it looks like a video game that totally could suffice for a launch game. It reminds me a lot of Heroes of Ruin for the Nintendo 3DS from N-Space, of just like this super generic action RPG kind of thing that, yeah, you're going to be able to sink some time into. But will you love the time you sink into it? I don't get the impression you will from what I've seen of Godfall. It seems like a totally capable, you know, third-person action game kind of thing. And I feel like it will probably sell fairly well, just for the fact that, you know, it is on new platforms, and it is on PlayStation 5 and PC specifically, those two platforms. So it is like a true next-gen release of that there's no previous console version as far as that I'm aware. So I think it will sell on that merit. And multiplayer loot games are pretty popular, right? So I think it'll do well, but I think it will be one of those kind of frivolous Red Steel kind of launch successes, where Red Steel 1 sold incredibly well for the fact that it was a launch game on the Wii. But then when it comes around to doing Red Steel 2, nobody wants Red Steel 2. So, I mean, I love Red Steel 2, don't get me wrong, but the majority of the world did not want a Red Steel 2. And so I feel like Godfall might fall into that, where it does well for when it's coming out and what it's doing. But yeah, I doubt we're witnessing the birth of a new franchise or something with Godfall. But hey, maybe we'll see. We'll see how things go. Otherwise, I think in general, PlayStation 5 releases look okay enough. Like, you know, Sackboy game, I forget the game that's called, Little Big Planet. That looks weirdly like Super Mario 3D World to some extent, in terms of like how it has like an isometric platformer in some ways, and you kind of move around in 3D space. I didn't think about that when it was originally announced, but I was looking at the trailer earlier today. I was like, actually, this reminds me a lot of those Mario games. Not that I'm sitting there saying like, oh, Sony's copying, but it just, you know, a lot of it's just kind of that kind of fluff. I feel like a launch fluff, where it's like, here's a video game you could indeed buy and play. And you know, that is a Little Big Planet is a franchise people care about. But yeah, and I feel like that's just my general feeling. And the fact of the matter is that, you know, almost all these titles are also on PlayStation 4. So if you really want to play them without buying next-gen hardware, you can. I won't be playing them either way. So, or at least I can't imagine me playing them either way. In a vacuum, I'd love to play every video game. But when I think about my time, the one thing I probably am most impressed with the PlayStation 5, and probably the one real driving factor of why I would want to pick up PlayStation 5 in the short term, is the I think it's called haptic feedback shoulder triggers. So if you don't know, the shoulder triggers can like put resistance back. So like if you're I think in that Astrobot tech demo thing they put on there, if like you spray a water gun or something, and like there's like a resistance to when the water comes out, so the button will kind of like vibrate while you're pushing it down to kind of give you some feedback. And I think that's a very cool thing. I'm a big fan of the idea of HD Rumble on the Nintendo Switch. Whether Nintendo's been successful in delivering an HD Rumble is a whole other thing, right? But I like those kind of gimmicks. I like any kind of gimmick that brings part of the game world into the real world in terms of your feelings and interacting with it. So I am pretty excited about that. Well, I should be excited about that. The biggest problem is that, you know, given that PC is a bigger market than it has been in the past, and, you know, the Xbox Series X not really having that functionality, it's really questionable how many games will build anything particularly towards that. And I'm not a big fan of most Sony first-party titles. Like, pretty much since the PlayStation 3 era, probably about late PS3, I think Last of Us was really real defining line of just like, oh man, all these Sony first-party titles are not games I want to play. Like, they all have like a very similar aesthetic and a very similar style of storytelling. In a lot of ways, very similar gameplay. You know, I'm not going to sit there and say like, oh, The Last of Us and God of War are the exact same video game, right? But I think they share a lot of things that I don't particularly care about. Or they value a lot of things I don't particularly value myself in games. So it's really hard for me to get really excited for those. But you know, if they do go out of their way to do more than just like what Astrobot's doing, because it seems like Astrobot does at least make a good attempt at trying to utilize those features. I definitely could see in the future there being like 1 or 2 releases that I'm like, I gotta have that, because the shoulder buttons, if they go out of their way to do that. It's like Sinner Kagura Reflections on the Switch. I was like, I gotta have that game. I don't really care about Sinner Kagura that much, or the fact that it's like a lady rubbing game, but I want to experience the HD rumble and what they're trying to do with that game. I'm gonna have a video on that game eventually, I promise. I have not started working on it. I probably shouldn't promise because I have not started working on it, but eventually. Anyways, I don't really have a ton of interest in what Sony puts out first party wise. So yeah. And in terms of the Xbox Series X lineup, I think there are games that I particularly have more interest in. I will not say that they're better games. I think Sony has the better lineup overall at launch, at least. Ones that stood out to me is Bright Memory. That's that first-person shooter that it has like a lot of melee action combat in it. So in some ways, it reminds me a little bit of Red Steel, and it also has a lot of momentum to it as well. I think that game looks really cool. I don't think that will be a great game. They're touting like, one-man development team, and it looks like a pretty good game. It does not look great, but it looks pretty good overall visually. It looks like a low-budget AAA game in a lot of ways. I do not have the confidence that translates into actual video game quality, but it looks nice enough, at least, I guess I should say. But it looks like the kind of game I would be into, and if I had an Xbox Series X, I think I'd definitely check it out. I know it's on PC, and maybe I'll check it out there. But I'm not trying to factor in PC in this conversation, to be honest with you. So I'll kind of leave that alone. And then the other game was The Medium. I think this got pushed back until like January 2021. The Medium looks pretty cool though. It basically looks like a puzzle game where you're kind of like switching between 2 different realities, I guess you could say, or worlds. And it reminds me a lot of, I think there's like a Soul Reaver game on the Dreamcast that did a similar thing. Makes me think of like Resident Evil 4 and not the Fog demo. Which demo was it? The Resident Evil 4 demo was the last demo before they showed actual Resident Evil 4, where like the world would change blue and then the world would end up like a different state. It reminds me a little bit of that, and I think it looks pretty cool, and I like the aesthetic of the game quite a bit. And if I got an Xbox Series X like day one, I had to pick one game, I probably would pick up the Medium in January, I guess, because it's not a day one game. But yeah. The big thing for Series X probably for me is the expanded backwards compatibility. I think this is something that has been kind of surprising in how much the internet's taken an interest in this. But I guess I should say surprising in how much my Twitter feed has taken an interest in this. Obviously, there's a curated, feed to some extent of the people who probably would be interested in backwards compatibility. I probably would be more likely to follow them. But I'm pretty happy with the what I've seen of the backwards compatibility and how it's affecting games. The fact that it goes back and like improves performance on Xbox 360 games. I saw someone post like a Sonic Unleashed video of the game running at a higher frame rate than it usually did in some areas. I think that's really awesome. And as somebody who has not, spent a lot of time with the Xbox 360 or original Xbox, that has a lot of value to me. But, I do have an original Xbox and an Xbox 360, so it's not a huge deal. But yeah, it's just, and this is something that Sony's doing too, to some degree, right? They are supporting PS4 backwards compatibility support. And I saw that there was like a video out there of Disaster Report 4 in a very similar situation where that game runs kind of rough on a PlayStation 4, but when you put it in a PlayStation 5, it actually runs pretty well, right? So that stuff's definitely happening. I think the big difference is that Microsoft seems to be committed to doing more long-term backwards compatibility support, where they probably will continue to add games, or at least that seems to be what they're implying that they're going to be doing in the future. Where PlayStation 4 you're going to get, or PlayStation 5 you're going to get the PlayStation 4 stuff, and that's going to be kind of the end-all be-all of that. I mean, that doesn't mean they can't patch something in later. I mean, they brought original Xbox games to Xbox One at some point, right? So that's definitely a possibility, but I don't get the impression that that's super important to Sony. I don't even see them really touting the PS4 improvements either, to be honest with you. I think they're just not really messaging it, and I think it's very much on purpose, right? Because they kind of had a message that was like the PlayStation 5 is next-gen performance, next-gen gaming or something, and then Xbox Series X is something that's straddling the line, and then they proceeded to announce most of their games were also on PS4. So I think it comes to that same kind of thing where like they're like, oh, we don't want to talk about you playing last gen games, we want to talk about playing the next games kind of thing, even though, you know, the only one that is really a next gen exclusive is Demon's Souls as far as I'm aware. So yeah, I don't know. Anyways, so that's me. That's enough of me complaining about these platforms and kind of talking about, you know what I specifically was interested in. But I think the reality is that there's just not really a lot of games for me there right now. I mean, Bright Memory and The Medium are not high on my list of games that I would be super interested in. They are games that I do have an interest in, but not super interested. So it's just not something that I really need to do right now. So what am I looking for in next gen consoles? And I think if you know me pretty well, you probably know the answer is probably Japanese games and figuring out what's going to happen there. Because, you know, when you think of Xbox, outside of a particular set of games, you don't really think about Japanese games. It's just not really what that platform's about. But they have been doing some, giving it some effort over the years. They've done work with Inti Creates, it seems like, with getting some of the Gunvolt stuff over. Although I think they're still missing even some of those with like, I think Gunvolt 1 and 2 are still not on Xbox One. I could be wrong about that. But if it did come out on Xbox One, it came out later than the PlayStation 4 release. And you know, admittedly, Inti Creates not the hugest company, so they can't just like pour everything all at once usually. But they've also been getting like a really big push to Sega. You know, they still have kind of locked up Phantasy Star Online in the West. There is a PlayStation 4 version of Phantasy Star Online in Japan, but we still are not seeing that here overseas. I'm not sure what the timeline looks like on that. I remember when they originally announced Phantasy Star Online 2 was finally getting localized after a ridiculous amount of time. They had said the PlayStation 4 version was probably going to come out, and then I think it's been, you know, at least, I guess it's only been like, you know, a handful of months or something. So there's definitely space for that to happen, especially, you know, as we get into PlayStation 5. And then like Yakuza, they're like pushing really hard with Yakuza Like a Dragon on Xbox Series X. Again, that game is on other platforms, and even in the West in this case. But they really seem to be pushing that game as like, hey, think of Xbox when you think of Yakuza Like a Dragon. Although I'm sure the majority of sales for that game are going to be coming for the PlayStation 4 version, right? So yeah, they definitely have tried some things, and there's also some games that I wouldn't typically expect to be on there, although these are also Sega titles like Media Vision. I've been talking a lot about Media Vision this year. The Valkyria Chronicles games they've worked on, Shining Resonance, all those came to Xbox One. Namco Bandai's anime games, I think the majority of that stuff comes out on Xbox One. I don't think that there's a lot that is like exclusive to PlayStation 4. They pretty much will port anything to anything. It's like, hey, Sword Art Online fans, we got you covered no matter what. Fairy Tail fans, we got you covered no matter what. You want to play your Fairy Tail game on Xbox? Here you go. I have no idea if that Fairy Tail game is actually on Xbox. So I feel like most of the time if I look at something Bandai Namco, it's on Xbox as well. I think Koei Tecmo as well. Have they done any Xbox stuff? I can't remember. Anyways, that being said, you know, that stuff is great, cool, and I'm interested in that stuff as well. But there's just a lot of problems with Xbox and Japanese support, particularly two really big ones that I continue to kind of complain about is Square Enix. Like, Sony is still locking up Square Enix for chunks of time. Final Fantasy 16, which they announced, is definitely PS5 exclusive for a period of time, it seems like, at the very least. That is at least what was announced when they showed off the game. You know, I think it will eventually come to Xbox, but it'll be delayed, right? And I think when you're trying to establish where, you know, a Western audience who's interested in Japanese games is going, Square Enix is very important. And if their lead games are launching on PlayStation first, I feel like that's where a lot of like people who are interested in that stuff are going to go. It's a trickle down effect, I guess. I feel like Atlas. I'm not a big. I don't remember the last Atlas game I played. I'm not a big Atlas fan. I'm still surprised that their stuff does not come out on Xbox though. Especially since Sega is involved with them. So I feel like Atlas would be something that they really need to go out of their way to do, even if just getting like the latest Persona 5 version. I feel like the Persona games have a lot of legs, and so if you just continue to ignore that those games came out, I feel like you're continuing to just fall behind. But I don't know. I feel like they should probably put out Persona 5 Royal on on Xbox Series X, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Anyways, so I think that's going to be the biggest hurdle when it comes to Microsoft. And Final Fantasy 14, I always say, I'm not a big Final Fantasy 14 fan. I'm kind of a I kind of have a grudge against Final Fantasy 14 because I was actually somebody who's a fan of not 1.0 directly, but 1.23, the pre-relaunch version of that game. I thought like that game was great outside of the technical issues. And I feel like Final Fantasy 14 2.0 and beyond ruined all that. So again, I'm not going to say it's not a good game, but I just think that game's very important long term as well, I feel like, and still not having that on Xbox. Like that was something I've been saying that they need to do on Xbox One already. So I don't know. I just think those are important games, and it just continues to show Microsoft struggling with Japanese games, particularly with Square Enix. I think they really need to get Square Enix and them talking in a way that they can figure something out and then, drop whatever money they need to get at least parity with Sony, right? And then a couple other things with Square Enix too is just like some of their smaller titles just never come to Xbox. Some of this stuff I think a lot of people be like, yeah, who cares? Left Alive did not come to Xbox. The Quiet Man did not come to Xbox. Those little tinier experimental games that often go bad do not come to Xbox. And so I think that also is a big problem for me specifically, not the rest of the world. I don't think Microsoft is like, man, we got to get the Quiet Man, but I'm like, you should have the Quiet Man. I want to see Quiet Man running on a Series X. So yeah. The other thing that I would want out of Japanese games is the smaller stuff that comes out, and I think this is actually probably the most interesting thing, and probably the biggest thing that would keep me from making a definitive choice between an Xbox Series X and a PlayStation 5. Because when I think of a lot of tinier Japanese games, you have stuff like Disaster Report that's largely been coming out on Sony platforms. I think there's a Switch version of Disaster Report as well. But a lot of times they end up being like also the horny games. So you end up with like Gun Pixies and, Sinner Kagura and Kandagawa Jet Girls. I can back Gun Pixies and Kandagawa Jet Girls. I have not played a real Sinner Kagura game yet. But those are games that have largely been focused on PlayStation platforms. And kind of the big question mark here is that Sony's like updated policies regarding sexual content and things like that has been really a thorn in the side of these games. To some extent, Oni-Chanbara is coming out on PS4 still. And, that game's very, very sexually sexish, I guess that's a phrase we could use, sexually sexish. But D3's kind of response to those policy things was like, yeah, we just kind of pre-follow Sony's guidelines before we design our games to make sure we're within the bounds. And Sinner Kagura 7 kind of ended up in some weird development hell because they're like, we actually can't do what we want with this game anymore because Sony's saying we can't do what we want with it. When Kandagawa Jet Girls came out, again, I think Kandagawa Jet Girls is a great game, but a lot of people who were looking at it were Sinner Kagura fans, and they were looking for more of that fan servicey nature, and that just wasn't there. So I wonder like how much those policies will actually push those kind of games away from PlayStation 5 as a platform. If you haven't seen Galgun Returns, that is not coming to PlayStation platforms at all. It's coming to Switch, Xbox, and PC. Surprising it came to Xbox. I wonder if it would have, admittedly this is an Inti Creates thing, and they've been kind of doing stuff on Xbox off and on, but the original Galgun was a Xbox 360 game as well, so I wonder if that was, a part of it too. But seeing it come to every platform but Sony's platform, I wonder if that's going to be something that in the future will kind of push those developers away. Now, I think the real thing that will happen is that if they don't go to PlayStation 5 anymore, they're probably not going to go to Xbox either. They're probably going to just focus on Switch for their lead SKU and be like, here's your sexy game on Switch. It runs at 20 frames per second and is 900p resolution-wise. So I think some people will be unhappy about that, but it would probably give them more freedom to do like creatively. And I don't really get the impression that the Sinner Kagura fans are happy with what's happening, with that franchise because of a lot of things that happen with Sony. There could be some greater issues. Again, I have not played that many Sinner Kagura games outside of some of the spin-off ones that I really enjoyed, but I have not played a mainline one. And the reason I like the spin-off games are for those particular reasons, or for like particularly or specific to the spin-offs rather than Senran Kagura as a whole, so I don't know if I actually like Senran Kagura games. But Neptunia 1 is actually getting a remake on PlayStation 5, so I think that's probably the first sign of that kind of game still coming to PlayStation instead of any other platform. I think it's PlayStation 5 only, but if it's not, I would say it's probably on PC, and if not day and date, within like 6 months or something. I don't know. I can't remember the exact release thing. Also, one other thing was Poison Control, which I think is actually a Koei Tecmo game, and is also published by NAS America, I think, in the US. I don't know how it was in Japan, but in the US, they're pushing the Switch version of that game more than anything, despite there being a PlayStation 4 version. So again, I think there's just an interesting opportunity there for there to be some shakeup in that space. Because of what Sony's been doing to kind of push those developers around in terms of what they can do on the platform and things like that. So yeah, that's kind of the big thing that's really kind of in the air for me when it comes to which one I'll get. And if I had to choose one today, if I had to choose an Xbox Series X or a PS5 today, I'd probably do a Series X. And the reason why is that the backwards compatibility, just, long term, Microsoft's commitment backwards compatibility, I think, will help me out. Like I said earlier, I have not spent a lot of time on Xbox games or Xbox 360 games. And, I'm typically somebody who does not mind frame rates so much, or even like how a game looks visually that much. But when it comes to resolution, particularly any sub HD resolution, I'm always like, man, this would look nice if it was running on a nicer console for this. So, admittedly, there's not a ton of original Xbox games you can play on an Xbox Series X, but it is nice that, like, Full Spectrum Warrior, I'll continue, every time I talk about this, I just say Full Spectrum Warrior. That is the one example I want to give, because Full Spectrum Warrior is a great game. Like, if I want to play Full Spectrum Warrior, highest frame rate, highest resolution possible, the Xbox Series X is the place to go, kind of thing. And that, I just don't get the impression Sony cares long term, and so probably what we're getting out at launch is what we're going to see, kind of the beginning and the end of what they're going to be offering for backwards compatibility. I just don't have a lot of confidence they're going to offer too much more, especially with like how half-assed their PlayStation 2 Classic support was on PS4. I don't think PlayStation 1 Classics ever came to PS4 in any way either. So yeah. The other thing that would probably be, the things that would probably keep me from wanting to do, or I guess the things that would make me regret getting a Series X probably is, to some extent, Final Fantasy 16. I'm not excited about Final Fantasy 16 for the same reasons I'm not like happy with how Final Fantasy 14 turned out. If you don't know, the guy who directed Final Fantasy 14's reboot is the one who's directing that Final Fantasy 16. Directing Final Fantasy 16. I almost said Final Fantasy 16 remake. We're already remaking it. So it's just like, I have confidence in him make a good game, and a game that's going to have mass market appeal. I don't have confidence in him to make an interesting game. And if they go full-fledged on open world game this time around, where Final Fantasy 15 was just kind of this weird nightmarish combination of open world and linear gameplay, I think I will be significantly less interested in what Final Fantasy 16 has to offer. But as somebody who's largely played every mainline Final Fantasy, and beaten most of them, I feel like I at some point I gotta play Final Fantasy 16. But again, I think that will come to Xbox at some point. And then just, waiting to see where the smaller Japanese games go. Like I said earlier, Neptunia is going to PlayStation 5, but I don't think there's been too many other small Japanese titles announced for next-gen consoles yet. So over the next year, I'll be kind of watching and seeing and see what happens, And I guess one point to make too is that this is not anything new for me when it comes to waiting. Like, the 3DS was the last system I got, like, launch day. And admittedly back then, I was doing more coverage that was like cutting edge coverage. I don't want to say cutting edge, right? But I was covering games that were actively coming out and trying to be a part of the conversation. I was working for VG Charts at the time, as well as was the writer at the Speed Gamers. So I felt kind of a need to do a service and cover that kind of stuff, because that was the stuff people cared about on those websites. Where pretty much since then I've kind of dropped off on bothering with getting anything immediately. I usually will get Nintendo's platforms within a year. I'm generally still mostly a fan of Nintendo first-party games when it comes to first-party output. I don't care what Sony or Microsoft's doing. So if I'm going to choose a platform, Nintendo is the one I go for usually, just because I have more interest in what they're doing. but I would not say I'm particularly a huge first-party Nintendo fan at this point in my life either. It's just that's where I lean. So Wii U and Switch, I got those even though, I only had 1 or 2 games I wanted, but I knew long-term I was going to be getting some titles that I would be interested in. The biggest problem with Switch is just because it's underpowered, anything that's multi-platform, I'm going to go for another platform for. And then for the PS4, I waited until the PS4 Pro. I got that and then got Final Fantasy 15, and that was when I finally jumped on the PS4 train. So it took me a while. So, I'll probably, unless there's some real big change in kind of what kind of releases are coming out, I'll probably stick around on last gen consoles the next year. Another big thing of this too is that I cover a lot of old games. I would not, and this is probably something I talk about in the future. I'm not somebody who would say I'm like, oh, I'm a retro game enthusiast kind of thing, but I do like video games as a whole and the history of video games. And it just happens to be that the history of video games mostly happens in the past. But like if you saw, I played Kanagawa Jet Girls as soon as that came out, and a few other things, right? So it's not that I'm just like, oh, I only care about old games. It's just a matter of, most video games came out a long time ago, and only the few video games coming out today are a very small percentage of video games, right? So I just kind of focus there probably because I have more time to think about that. And yeah, I did the math. I have 625 video games I have not finished. So I have a pretty big backlog too. So yeah, anyways, I guess that's it. So I just kind of sat here and rambled for a bit. I don't know if this was anything. Will we do this again? I don't know. Maybe not in the kotatsu. The setup I have here is a little crazy to make this work, and I feel like we did not gain anything of it. I mean, I got toasty legs, sure, but I don't think anybody else in the world cares that I have toasty legs. The toasty legs are not conveyed through YouTube. So yeah. Anyways, but yeah, we won't be having any next gen coverage here anytime soon. So I don't really have anything to push you to if you're interested in PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X. But yeah, recently I did a Super Mario Land video. So if you want to go do that, or go look at that, I did that kind of featured review kind of thing. And then sometime soon I have a Bionic Commando Rearmed video, or not Rearmed, Elite Forces for the Game Boy Color. I keep wanting to say Rearmed, but no, Elite Forces for the Game Boy Color. Old Game Boy games. You can go check that out if you want to. Hey, talking about consoles, actually, instead of Bionic Commando, don't go look at that. Go look at my PCFX podcast with Filler. That's a game console that has games that I kind of want on it. It's a cool console. I would pick it over the PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X at this moment, but in the future, who can say? Maybe the entire PCFX library will end up on the PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X. Phil Spencer is going to come out on stage, rip off his shirt, and it's just going to, not rip off his shirt. No, he's going to rip off his shirt, and he's just going to have tattooed across his chest, Future X, that's what FX stands for, supposedly. So he'll just have Future X tattooed across his hairy chest and say, PCFX support, 1080p, remastered FMVs. We made all the games 18 plus. Anyways, that's it. Thanks for coming. OneControlWord.com is the website, and I hope you have a great week. Bye.